passe perfect, tu vois.
Ouais.
Tu vois, moi, en tout cas, c'est comme ça que je l'ai fait. En gros, j'ai suivi et à chaque fois, j'ai essayé de marquer
À quoi il sert mon texte?
les présents de vérité générale aussi, j'ai retenu un moment, c'est marrant parce que c'est un nom passé, mais on exprime le présent, un inverse par un présent, mais qui renvoie dans le passé. En gros, ouais, c'est assez spécifique.
Par rapport à ce que les autres c'est le prix de transcription. C'est un texte il y en a plein. Et les trucs, tu vois, ça va, mais ce qui fait chier, c'est que comme elle va mettre tous les trucs de variété à l'intérieur, je sais pas, dans l'épreuve de langue, j'ai vraiment pas la vidéo en traduction, il y a pas ça va être tendu. Il faudra mettre le paquet en c'est ça, c'est ce que je me disais aussi. Je suis vraiment focalisé dans le truc. Après, ça va, ça va. Ça va. Je pense que c'est à partir de cette semaine, c'est ceux qui sont aussi sur la culture. Et à partir de nous, c'est la semaine prochaine. Et après, on fait une semaine sur deux, je crois. On a dit d'activité aussi, c'est ça. Ouais. Est-ce que c'est pas aussi long que le cours de des écoles? En plus, là, on n'a pas de facilité, on n'a pas regardé, donc ça va être un peu genre, je pense. Non, alors c'est quoi? Alors, c'est après, quand c'est maths, ça ouais, c'est ça. Parce que, ouais, Elise et Marie, elles ont entendu les oracles. Ouais, t'avais dit, ouais, je les ai entendus. Ils avaient bossé sur les molécules. Moi aussi.
Alors, bonjour. Ouais. Oui, pas de problème, ne vous inquiétez pas. Partez discrètement, c'est tout. Ça qui va bien dans les salles ici, c'est que même quand il fait froid dehors, il fait chaud à l'intérieur. Alors, est-ce... Toujours toute une histoire pour brancher. Est-ce que par rapport à la semaine dernière, je n'ai pas envie de refaire tout l'appel, est-ce que par rapport à la semaine dernière, il y a des personnes qui n'étaient pas là la semaine dernière? Oui, je vais prendre, juste voir si vous êtes bien dans le groupe. Donc ça doit être ici. Alors... Donc, 502, voilà. Donc, qui vous disait, qui n'était pas là la semaine dernière? Votre nom? L.A. Non, Daphne. Ah oui, pardon. Marie, non, c'est ça? Oui, c'est bon. C'est bon aussi, pas de problème. Oui. Alors non, vous, c'est pas bon. Vous avez changé de groupe? Oui, d'accord. C'est fait sur l'IP web depuis. D'accord. Donc, je change. Ok. Je vais pas réextraire les listes. Qui d'autre n'était pas là la semaine? Alors, Erasmus, quel est votre nom? Ça s'écrit comment? Costa et Julia, c'est ça? D'accord. Vous avez accès au cours en ligne? Alors, il faut que vous m'envoyiez un mail en me disant que vous suivez le cours 502 anglais et je vous donnerai les... Voilà, mais envoyez-moi un mail pour que je le fasse. Qui d'autre n'était pas là la semaine dernière? Oh. Ça s'écrit comment, votre nom? D-E? D'accord. Vous avez accès aux cours en ligne? Je ne sais plus si je... Alors, vous m'envoyez un mail aussi, hein, pour que je puisse vous y donner accès. Il me faut votre email. D'autres personnes qui n'étaient pas là la semaine dernière? Ouais. Alors, normalement, vous étiez dans l'autre groupe. Vous avez changé? D'accord. Désolée, hein, je suis obligée de faire le point parce que... Hop, voilà. D'accord. D'autres personnes? Tout le monde était là, sinon? Oui. Les Erasmus, donc il y a Alessia et Julia. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres Erasmus? Oui. Je vous ai donné accès au cours en ligne? Ah, il faut que vous m'envoyiez un mail. Ah, si je n'ai pas votre mail, je ne peux pas. Donc, il faut que vous m'envoyiez un mail. Vous me dites que vous suivez le cours BUE 502 et je vous donnerai accès. Si vous avez besoin d'avoir accès à d'autres cours en ligne de L1, de licence LLCER, les Erasmus, vous me le dites aussi. Vous me dites les cours et je vous donnerai accès. C'est par année de diplôme, donc, mais juste pour LLCER anglais. D'accord? Donc, je m'en occuperai. Très bien. Donc, ça, c'est une bonne chose de faire. Okay, so after the presentation last week, presentation of the Victorian period and especially the late Victorian period, I'd like to say a few words about the Edwardian period. I don't think we had time to focus on the Edwardian period. It will be very short because the Edwardian period was very short. And most of the characteristics of the Edwardian period are very close to the characteristics of the late Victorian period. And this is why very often the whole period from 1880 to let's say 1914, which is even after the end of the Edwardian period, is very often analysed as a whole, because it is a whole, even if different monarchs reigned at the time. So King Edward, Edward VII, reigned for a very short time, 9 years only, from 1901, when Victoria died, to 1910. But generally, when you speak of the Edwardian period, you include the period until the First World War, even if it was not technically the Edwardian period any longer. King Edward was Victoria's son. So when his mother died, he became the king. And he, as I said, the Edwardian era is supposed to have lasted... C'est original. Derrière, il se passe des choses, il y a des choses écrites. The Edwardian period is supposed to have lasted, well, is included as lasting until the First World War, even if from 1910 a new king reigned, that is King George V. But we rarely speak of George V for the first years of his reign. The Edwardian period is very often thought to be a kind of golden, bright parenthesis in the history of Britain. A bright parenthesis, or a golden parenthesis, between the dark mood of the late Victorian period, the pessimism, the uncertainties, the doubts that we have already underlined, and, of course, the dark period of the First World War, which was a period of crisis, a period of war, a period of chaos. So this is why, very often, this period between 1901 and 1910 or 1914 is very often considered to be a bright parenthesis, the golden years of Great Britain. Because it is in between two dark periods in terms of mood, in terms of political situation. The truth was not so bright, in the sense that, of course, there was the feeling of a new century, and only this feeling of a new century after the pessimism of the late 19th century was something which pointed to something livelier, something more vivid, something a period when people wanted to experience new things, to experience new, yes, to meet with new people. The adjective new was very fashionable at the time. There had been the new woman in the late 19th century, and it seemed that almost everything was new at the beginning of the 20th century. 20th century. Of course, this was just an illusion. The Victorian spirit took a long time to completely disappear. The Victorian spirit, as it's called, had been a spirit which had marked the British population for over 60 years, which is a very long time. And it's not during the reign of King Edward, that is the short 9 years of his reign, that the Victorian spirit could completely disappear. So the Edwardian period was more or less the continuation of the Victorian period, but with a desire for something new. It was really a period of transition. And this is why it is so often associated with the late 19th century, because the whole, that is from the 1880s, late 19th century, to to the First World War, were the years of transition to modernity. British power at the time was quite strong. Prosperity was quite apparent. But at the same time, there was a rising interest in socialism, in different types of political or social movements, which had already emerged in the late 19th century, as we'll see. One of these movements, for instance, is the movement of the suffragettes. The suffragettes, the associated with the new women. We'll study, of course, the history, the story of the suffragettes, when we focus on women and the way they became more visible in the public sphere. But the early 20th century is also a period of social movements, political movements, workers' movements as well, against their conditions of living, their conditions at work as well. And the Edwardian age, and this is very often what we remember, forgetting about these social movements, etc. The Edwardian age is also marked by the development of mass leisure. Mass leisure, especially with the cinema, especially with the cinema, yes, especially with sports, the development of automobiles, as we've seen, the development of the airplane, and also new types of expeditions, no longer to Africa, Asia, etc., but rather to the Arctic, the Antarctic. The great polar expeditions were expeditions during the Edwardian era. So it was exactly as the late 19th century, an age of discoveries, an age of experiences, of new experiments at all levels. So we'll take the period as a whole from about the 1880s until about the let's say 1914, the beginning of the First World War, even if, and I'm insisting on this, it was already King George who was reigning at the beginning of the First World War. So it's a period closely linked to the late Victorian age, but with a different spirit, a spirit that was more oriented towards the future, whereas the late Victorian period was rather oriented towards the past and feared the future. They feared the turn of the century. If you take the whole period, that is the period from 1880 to 1940, it's obvious that it's the period which defines the modern era as we knew it at the beginning of the 20th century after the First World War. And it's a period which is, well, very often when you read books about Victorian history, the focus is on the early and mid-Victorian periods, very rarely on the late Victorian period. And yet, the late Victorian period and the Edwardian period really allow us to understand the modern era. Everything, in a way, was born during this period. This was not a period of great literary names, for instance, but this was a period which prepared the next great artists, in a way. It was a period of experiments, and people needed to make experiments in all directions before being able to produce something coherent, I would say. One of the main feelings was, at the same time, excitement towards all that was new, imagining all that could happen in the future, but also a sense of anxiety as to what the future would hold in stock. It was really the sense of, and one historian used these words, a sense of lost bearings. A sense of lost bearings, comme quand on perd ses repères. A sense of lost bearings in the sense that there were so many new things, so many, and especially so many new things in the public sphere, and this is the concept that we're going to define now, that there was this sense of lost bearings, this sense of doubts, of uncertainties as to what the future would look like. Imagine a society, and to me it's exactly the same impact as the internet revolution in the years, well, let's say the early 2000s. Imagine a society which suddenly was, in a way, was becoming more compact because it could have access to different parts of the world more and more easily through new means of transport, but also through new means of communication, right? Imagine a society in which it was much easier to move all around, and imagine a society in which suddenly, in the public sphere, and we'll define what the public sphere was, in the public sphere, suddenly new groups were visible. The poor, as we've said, aliens, as they were called at the time, but also women. This, of course, reinforced this period of doubts, of uncertainties. It was at the same time exciting in a way, but also something which frightened people. And we'll see in the texts that we'll study today, we'll see this mixture, this mixing, these mixed feelings of anxiety and at the same time excitement at the new panorama that the city offered, right? So today we're not going to focus on one group in particular. We'll read several texts. I have selected a few texts for this class, which we'll read together, which we'll analyze together, a few reactions to the new people that were visible in the public sphere during this period, from 1880 to about the First World War. And we'll see how people were surprised at seeing this new public in the public sphere, women, but also strangers, foreigners, and also the poor, and we'll see how they reacted to it. So we'll just analyze their reactions today. I've taken a few examples that are really characteristics of many texts written at the time on the topics, right? But before analyzing this, I'd like to focus on the notion of the public sphere. Well, first, the whole period was fascinated by exploration in general. What I mean by exploration, I've already said a few words about this, but I would like to detail what I said last week. What I mean by exploration is, first of all, spatial exploration. The late Victorians, well, the Victorians in general, but the late Victorians in particular, the Edwardians, liked exploring the world. They liked exploring the world, and they lived at a time when exploring the world was easier and easier, right? Well, not as easy as today, of course, but easier. So spatial exploration is the first level of this love for exploration at the time. Spatial exploration meant exploration of distant lands, the colonies, the Arctic, the Antarctic, for instance, the expeditions. Very often these expeditions to Africa, to Asia, to Arctic, Antarctic, very often they had a scientific basis initially, but they were also here to discover new peoples and to relate what the British had learned about these people. Well, when we study this in more details, you'll see that, of course, the accounts were very biased, and the way foreigners were seen, the people from the colonies especially, were seen, was completely biased. But yet, there was this desire to explore the world. This was, of course, in keeping with the emergence of tourism. Mass tourism emerged at the end of the 19th century. The first, for instance, will study extracts from guidebooks from the time. The first guidebooks, for instance, to discover Egypt or to discover other distant lands, were written by Baedeker. Baedeker guides still exist today, in the late 19th century. So, emergence of tourism, mass tourism, but not only in distant lands, but also at home. That is, the development of sometimes short trips to the seaside or to another part of the country, which also allowed people to move much more than they moved before. Because there was the train, because there were also days off, which did not exist before, because of a certain number of factors, which I'm not going to detail here. So spatial exploration And spatial exploration, and this is important because we're going to be concerned by this, spatial exploration included what I will call urban exploration. That is the exploration of cities. Why the exploration of cities? Well, simply because the city was still a new phenomenon at the time. I don't have the exact figures, but if you take London at the beginning of the Victorian period and London in 1901, I think the populations had multiplied by 6, 7, 8, 10 maybe. There was a tremendous growth of big cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, London, etc. at the time, which meant that more and more people visited it, more and more people lived in it, and in the late Victorian period, you had many accounts written by what you call today urban explorers, mostly men, bourgeois men, educated men, of course, who simply walked aimlessly in the city, looking around, and described what they saw. It was a kind of physical discovery of the city, which later on, in the early 20th century, rather became a kind of a psychological approach to the city. That is, the city, once it had been explored physically, geographically speaking, was rather explored by writers as a way of understanding one's own mind. If you take T.S. Eliot, for instance, if you take Joseph Conrad, if you take those authors, or if you take Virginia Woolf, for instance, all those authors of the early 20th century, they no longer visited the city or explored the city to understand its geography, because they more or less already mastered its geography. But they explored the city to feel the link between the city and their mind. This is also what you call psychogeography. The psychogeography movement is a movement which was born in the 1950s or 1960s, but already in the early 20th century, there were the beginnings of this psychogeography. So spatial exploration. The second level is temporal exploration. Well, this is of less interest to us in this course, but I just wanted to quote it. That is, exploration of the past, the distant past, and of the future. You remember last time I told you prehistory was a new concept at the time. The exploration of prehistory and what it meant that there was a history before the beginning of history was something which produced uncertainties in many people's minds. Same thing with, the same holds with the exploration of the future. The emergence of science fiction, short stories, novels, etc. Take The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, for instance. So exploration of the past, exploration of the future, and all the anxieties that went with them. And if I'm quoting them today, it's because, as far as we're concerned, when we study the different groups going public, becoming visible in the public sphere in this period, it's obvious that very often when writing about these groups becoming public, the authors of the time, the typically bourgeois writers of the time, male bourgeois writers of the time, typically voiced their fears about the future. What would happen? What would happen once women, for instance, were at the same level as men in the public sphere, or once the poor were at the same level as the rich in the public sphere. So this notion of the exploration of the future, especially, is something which is indirectly, at least, linked with what I would like to show you. There were also cultural exploration, cultural aesthetic explorations, in the sense that many movements, many aesthetic cultural experiments happened during the time, and also, very important as well, even if it's not linked with what we're going to develop in this course, explorations of the mind, the beginning of psychoanalysis, all the psychological studies of the time. The common point between these types of explorations is the notion of exploring what generally critics call uncharted territories. That is, territories that have not been mapped before.
Sorry, what was the...
Uncharted territories. Territories that have not been mapped before. If you take, for instance, Africa, if you take a Victorian map of Africa, generally you had Africa, then you had a few names along the coast of Africa, and the rest of the map was blank. So what the Victorians wanted to do is explore the blank which was not blank at all, even if there was much jungle, but there were African people living there. But the white explorers, the Anglo-Saxon explorers, had never been there before, and they wanted to explore these parts that they didn't know. There was really a thirst for knowledge in the Victorian period, and especially at the end of the Victorian period. If you take, for instance, the end of the Victorian period, the 1880s, it was the period of what was called the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa, that is when everybody, the French, the British, the Belgians, the Portuguese, etc., wanted to go to Africa and be the first to be in such or such a place in Africa to take control, of course, over some African lands. Because they knew, of course, it was not out of, it was to make profit, most of all. Even if the first explorers sometimes went just out of curiosity and for scientific reasons, very often, in the end, it was profit which guided these explorations. So the Scramble for Africa is a very good example of this type of explorations. And it's the same for all the rest. When you take urban exploration, what the writers wanted to do, what the journalists wanted to do, was to map the big cities. To go to the places where generally authors did not go because they were too poor, because they did not want to enter these places. And you will see when we study poverty and the way it was accounted for at the time, you'll see that they describe the poor places as if they were describing distant lands, as if they were entering a dangerous foreign country with different customs, as if the poor, in fact, and this is very often the word that they use, as you'll see, as if the poor were, and I'm quoting them, a race apart. Exactly as they thought that the Africans were a race apart, right? So this is the common point between all these explorations. It was a way of exploring other forms of life, other forms of expressions, even if, in the end, there was very often this notion of profit, which was in the background. So in this context of exploration, it's also crucial to note that these explorations, for the first time, because throughout the Victorian period there had been explorations, but at the end of the Victorian period and in the Edwardian period, these explorations became more and more visible to the general public. Why? Because more and more people could read, because books were cheaper and cheaper, and more people could buy them, because there were more and more libraries where people could borrow books, or where people could go and spend a few hours reading books, because with electricity it was easier to read at night, at home, etc., etc. So the series of advances at the end of the 19th century made it possible for these explorations to become more and more visible, to become more and more known to the great public, to the general public, right? So it's not that there were more explorations at the end of the 19th century, it's that more and more people were aware of these explorations. And this is a very capital point. Another means of making these explorations more visible, aside from newspapers, books, etc., was the birth of cinema. The birth of cinema. Initially, the first films were very often documentary films. And I'll show you a few films of the time. Well, not today, but during another lesson. And you'll see that at the time, very often, there were short films that were filmed, and very short, a few minutes. They could be on any type of topic, sometimes daily life topics, sometimes films that were shot in the colonies, and they were shown not in cinema or cinema theaters initially, because there were no such places as these, but they were shown in the fairgrounds, in the music halls. That is, a film was shot, and in the evening, or the day after, they were shown, they were screened for the general public in the music halls, in the fairgrounds, in different places like
these. I was just going to say that there's a good example of that in the adaptation of Paddington movies.
Yeah, you're right.
It's actually pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the explorers and the movies they are shooting on the new lands.
On the new lands, and generally the day after, the late Victorians could watch the films in a music hall or in, yeah, absolutely. So you see, this made, for the first time, in a way, and I'll show you a few films by Mitchell and Kenyon, who were great cinematographers of the time, of the early 20th century, and their films were found maybe 10 years ago, a multitude of films from the early 20th century. And generally, they liked filming people leaving their job, for instance, or people in the streets, or etc., etc. And these films are very interesting in the sense that we see that the people of the time get familiar with the camera. They're waving at the camera, as we still do today, after many, many years. But they are obviously discovering the camera, and historians of cinema explain that at the time people liked going to the music hall or to the fairgrounds shows to watch themselves on the screen, you see, and recognize a friend or a neighbor on the screen. But it was also to show them, for instance, life in the colonies or life elsewhere in the world. And it was a way for people who were not necessarily people from the middle class. Many of them were working people. They just paid half a penny. This was the price to pay when you went to this type of show. And they could discover things they would never had access to maybe 20 years before. So all this explains, in a way, that the product of these explorations were more and more readily made available for everyone. Maybe not the very, very poor, maybe not the destitute, but including the working class. What was called at the time the respectable working class. So the period was a period of what I would call reshuffling of public territories. Reshuffling of public, une redistribution, reshuffling of public territories, reshuffling of frontiers in Britain, as well as throughout the Western world. And this took place at least 3 levels. The first level was the social, the class level. That is, the social or the class frontiers. The period from 1880 to 1900 1901 was a period when the poor became more and more visible. This will be one part of the course. The new visibility of poverty, not because there were the poverty did not exist before. Of course, poverty existed before. Poverty was not a new phenomenon, except that poverty was more and more urban poverty at the end of the 19th century, and that being poor in the city is different from being poor in the countryside, where there was a community to help the poor. In the city, in the big cities, this notion of community more or less disappeared. The people who had come from the countryside had settled down in the big cities, had, for some of them, ended up in prostitution or ended up as utterly destitute, were very often left completely alone, without a community to support them. So, in this way, poverty became more and more acute, because the phenomenon of poverty had a greater and greater impact, if you want. And the very poor, the destitute, became more important in terms of numbers at the time. But if the poor became more visible, it was not only because there were more poor people than before. It was first because they were concentrated in other places that were more visible, and it is also because people started to move between the different neighborhoods, that rich people for the first time visited the poor neighborhoods, and that poor people, little by little, because of the development of the omnibus especially, which was a very cheap means of transport, started to leave the places where they lived and to enter the other part of the city. If you take the example of London, at the time there was a very clear-cut opposition between the West End, which was the wealthy part of London, and the East End, which was the poor part of London. I don't know if you know London today, or well enough to be aware of this. The East End of London, which had always been the poor, destitute part of London, has been undergoing a complete reshuffling in the last 20 years, let's say. Now it's becoming, well, there are still poor places in the East End, but it's becoming a more and more bohemian. It's being gentrified, if you want. The prices, house prices, are becoming higher and higher, which forces, unfortunately, the poorest to leave this neighborhood, or at least the central part of this neighborhood. And it's an artistic neighborhood today. There's a mixing of foreign populations, or at least foreign-born populations, artists, young businessmen as well. But in the 19th century, and even in the early 20th century, the East End was one of the poor, really poor parts of London. And there was this opposition between West and East. And initially, West and East did not mix. At the end of the 19th century, the mixing between West and East started to emerge, with people from the East End not moving to the West End to settle down in the West End, but spending a day in the West End, or going through the West End to go to work, for instance. So there were more and more movements to and from the East End, which made, of course, the poor more visible. So this is what I've called the blurring of social frontiers. The fact that people, wealthy and poor people, mixed more and more. A good example of this is mixing through leisure activities. If you take, for instance, football, which became popular at the end of the 19th century, football was typically a place where people from different social classes mixed. Well, of course, there were seats for middle-class people and seats that were cheaper and that were occupied rather by the working class. But still, they shared the same leisure activity, which was something new. Before, there were leisure activities for the rich, leisure activities for the poor. At the end of the 19th century, another example is the seaside holidays. Initially, seaside holidays were just for the rich. If you take, for instance, Margate and Ramsgate, the two seaside resorts, well, not very far from London, initially, people went to Margate and Ramsgate, and the people who went there were rich people. And then, poor people could spend a day off at the seaside. And Margate became the place where they went. It was the more popular seaside resort. Ramsgate became the more fashionable, exclusive seaside resort. So the mixing was not complete, but still they shared the same type of activity, leisure activity, which was already a big step forward, right? Before, leisure activities for the poor were, I don't know, rat races or things like these, whereas the rich went to the theatre. The musical is another example. The musical was also for the poor. There were musicals which were very cheap and which poor people could also frequent. So this is the first type of blurring of frontiers, the social class frontier, and we'll spend a few weeks on this blurring and on the new visibility of the poor. The second type of blurring of frontiers is the gender frontier, the gender line, with the new visibility of women in the public sphere. Women became more and more visible in the public sphere. We'll explain why. We'll see how people reacted to this. And I've selected a few texts today to already introduce this. And of course, the visibility, the increased visibility of women in the public sphere was due to their slow emancipation. To their slow emancipation at the turn of the century and all the different political movements and social movements linked with their emancipation. And the third type of blurring of frontiers, blurring of territories, was what I would call, using inverted commas, using quotes, what I would call the race frontier. The race frontier. That is the new visibility of foreigners in the public sphere. Foreigners who became more and more important in terms of numbers, but also who became more and more visible in the sense that the ghettos in which they lived before became more open at the time and open to other people. So these different types of blurred frontiers, the gender frontier, the race frontier, the social or class frontier, led to the emergence of what many critics call contested spaces. A contested space means a space, a place in the public area, a space which is contested in the sense that different groups try to impose themselves in the space. Initially, the space was devoted to mostly white bourgeois, white male bourgeois, and suddenly, the space is contested. Some women are trying to enter the space. Some poorer people are trying to enter the space, and some foreigners are trying to enter the space. This is what I'm calling a contested space. And of course, when I'm speaking of a space, I'm not only speaking of physical or geographical spaces. I'm not, for instance, only referring to London City as a geographical place. I'm also referring, and the notion of the public sphere also includes this, I'm also referring to more virtual spaces. Like, for instance, I don't know, coverage in the press. You see, this is a more virtual space, coverage in the media, but this is also a part of the public sphere. At the end of the 19th century, obviously, most journalists were men, white, and upper middle class. That is, the only people who could voice their opinions, voice their feelings, were most of the time, maybe for 90% of them, white, Anglo-Saxon, bourgeois, and male. Most women, when they wrote, had to write under a pen name, and generally they were more or less obliged to take a male pen name, so as to be published. Not all of them, but many of them. And it's obvious that you very rarely find the opinion of a foreigner in the press of the time. So this is also the space that was contested at the end of the 19th century. The fact that suddenly women would like to express themselves, that foreigners would like to express themselves, and that the poor would like to express themselves. Of course, this has not entirely been solved, and it's obvious that even today, the main point of view is still probably that of let's say at least of the white male in our societies, but of course this has been improved quite a lot if you compare the situation with the Victorian society. Yes, so let's try now to define this notion of the public sphere, and then we'll focus on the texts that I would like you to analyze today. The theory was initially defined by Habermas. Can't pronounce his name in English. Habermas, I don't know. Habermas, H-A-B-E-R-M-A-S. In the 60s, and then he rewrote about the theory of the public sphere in the 1990s. The public sphere, according to him, is where, and I'm quoting him, is where public opinion can be formed. Where public opinion can be formed, and he adds, access to the public sphere is open in principle to all citizens. Access to the public sphere is open in principles to all citizens. And in his history of the public sphere, he analyzes what he calls the beginning of the public sphere, that is the 18th century literary salon, where the men of the time, mostly, not women, or very few women, discussed the issues of the time. This is what he defines as the first real expression of the public sphere. So the salon, in which the issues of the time were discussed, in which people could voice their opinion, in which they could disagree with one another. Except, of course, that the public sphere in these salons was reduced to the male bourgeois population or aristocratic population. And at the other end, he mentions internet forums to which absolutely, or almost everyone has access, at least in Western societies, and shows the evolution, of course, in the number of people having access to the public sphere in the 18th century and in the 21st century. Except that in this definition, of course, he does not take into account the fact that in the public sphere, if you take the internet, for instance, of course, almost everybody in our Western societies has access to the internet and can express himself or herself on the internet, but only very few are going to get attention to what they're writing. Which means that there are still, obviously, differences, a gap between those who voice their opinions and are heard, and those who voice their opinions but are very rarely heard. So, of course, the access is much more massive than in the 18th century, but there is still a bias, and still some people are more influent than others, even if the access is now completely public. I'm speaking of Western societies, of course. This would not be the case in some other societies, at least. So, in scholarly research, the public sphere generally refers to either a physical or a virtual space to which there is general access. So the notion of access is important in the definition of the public sphere, the fact that you can have access to the public sphere and that anybody should have access to the public sphere. And the notion of visibility is also important. That is, in the public sphere, everybody should be as visible as the other, which is not the case, but this is how it should be. And everybody should be able to voice his opinion or her opinion at the same level as the others. So the public sphere also includes a notion of spectatorship. If there is a public sphere, if people voice their opinion in the public sphere, some of them are also the spectators of the ones who voice their opinion. So there are those who voice their opinion, and there are also the spectators. They are all in the public sphere, all of them have access to the public sphere, but only those who voice their opinion get the attention. The others are just spectators. In the late Victorian period, an opposition was made between the public and the private sphere. If you read, for instance, studies about the evolution, the emancipation of women in the late Victorian period, you will always have the theory of the spheres, the public sphere against the private sphere. What did these spheres correspond to? Well, the public sphere at the time, in the late Victorian time, was only becoming slowly accessible to other groups than the typical male bourgeois man. When I'm speaking of public sphere in the late Victorian time, I'm not only speaking of the streets in general, I'm speaking of the places where people could express their opinions and be heard, which does not include the East End of London, if you see what I mean. Because the people there, well, they sometimes voice their opinion, of course, but most of the time nobody heard them, because there were no spectators at the time. They remained among themselves, if you want. So the public sphere was typically the places in the public sphere, for instance, in London, the places where people could debate on different issues or could voice their opinions, could voice their feelings on different issues. And this public sphere was only becoming slowly accessible to women, to the poor, and to foreigners. Women who were considered to be different based on gender, foreigners who were considered to be different based on race, and I'm using this term in quotes, and the poor who were considered to be different based on social class, based on, social class. So the public sphere as we know it today, if you take a street today, at least a street in democratic countries, it's a place where people are doing different types of things, but normally there is no particular group. Everybody is mixing normally, and you can see women, you can see children, you can see men, you can see people from different social classes, from different ethnic backgrounds, etc., etc. Well, this was not the case at the time. It was only starting to emerge, and at the time, as I've said, this was the same in virtual spaces, for instance, the media, the press, the cinema, etc., in which the main point of view in 95% of the case was that of the male bourgeois, educated writer, right? So this was starting to change. In fact, Habermas defines the public sphere as open to all citizens. But if you think in terms of late 19th century society, who could vote? That is, who was a citizen at the time? Certainly not women. They were only allowed to vote, and only a certain group of them in 1916, I can't remember the exact date, but yes, just at the time, just after the First World War, so certainly not women. They were not citizens in the sense that they were thought to belong to their husbands, and they were not able to vote at all. And certainly not poor people. They did not vote at the time. It's a mistake to think that all men could vote in the 19th century. Certainly not. Only men with a certain amount of properties could vote. That is a very small proportion of men, mostly educated, propertied, bourgeois men. So, indeed, the access to the public sphere was for all citizens, all that were considered citizens because they could vote at the time, right? Women did not have access to the vote, and they were not welcome in the public sphere. Foreigners, exactly the same. The poor, same thing. I'm insisting on the fact that when I'm saying that women, for instance, were not part of the public sphere, or foreigners were not part of the public sphere, I'm speaking of the only public sphere that mattered at the time, that is the bourgeois public sphere, which had an impact in the press, in the media, etc. Of course, in the poorer districts, you could see many women in the streets throughout the Victorian period. They had no other choice. Either they were prostitutes and worked in the streets, or they sold, I don't know, cabbage, cress, etc., and they worked in the streets, right? But this is why, for the bourgeois of the time, or the aristocrats of the time, a woman in the street was considered to be a disrespectable woman, a prostitute, or a poor woman. That is, someone who, yes, they had no respect for them. A bourgeois woman was not supposed to walk on her own in the streets at the time. So when I'm speaking of the public sphere, I mean this public sphere which had an impact on the way of the world. Yes, so obviously, as we'll see when we study these three groups, the white male bourgeois, typically, not all of them, but a great majority of them, fought to keep the control over the sphere. You have, for instance, a very interesting reaction of Sigmund Freud at the time. You all know Freud, of course. And at the time he saw a film which showed, it was in the very early 20th century, he watched a film which showed poor people enjoying themselves I can't remember what the leisure activity was, but they were enjoying themselves in the streets, laughing, etc. And he was absolutely disgusted by the spectacle, because he thought that what they did was disgusting. There was absolutely nothing disgusting. But it's just that they did not enjoy themselves in the same way as the bourgeois or the aristocrats enjoyed themselves at the time. And it was probably noisier, it was probably less respectable, as they thought at the time. And Freud was shocked by this. And he thought that the bourgeois, the educated people, should keep control on the public sphere, and that they should not have to see this type of spectacle in the public sphere. Same thing with women. The first women who entered the public sphere, the bourgeois public sphere, were harshly criticized, compared with prostitutes, etc., etc. So the period was a period of significant change, of increasing visibility, and also increasing audibility of these three groups. That is, it's also the period when there were women's movements, political movements. The suffragettes, for instance, would be a good example. But also the unions, the workers' unions became more and more powerful at the time, which meant that there were more and more strikes organized in the streets, workers' strikes, sometimes female workers' strikes. The match girl strike of 1888, if I remember well, is a good example. Girls working in a match factory in Les Allumettes, and they went on strike for quite a long time, and they protested against the working conditions, against the low wages that they got. And this made suddenly the condition of these women and these poor women, there's two new factors, this made their condition more visible, more audible to the rest of the public. And, of course, the access to culture, the fact that more and more people could read the newspapers, the fact as well that the popular press was born at the time. I told you last time that it was during the Jack the Ripper case in the late 1880s that the popular press emerged, and that it became more and more read, more and more widely read by the popular classes, but not only the popular classes. And all this explains that the voices of those who were never heard before, women, the poor, foreigners, could, little by little, be heard a little more in the public sphere. Right? So this is what we'll study. How the public sphere became accessible to a more general public, how the frontiers became more and more blurred, even if they were not completely, fully erased, and how this generated a lot of anxiety among the ruling classes, the fact of seeing women in the public sphere, the fact of seeing foreigners, more and more poor people, and many satirical texts were written at the time or drawn at the time in magazines, in newspapers, and this is what we're going to study. So, initially, if you take the beginning of the Victorian period, there was this opposition between public and private sphere. The public sphere was the sphere of society, the sphere of work, the sphere of the outside, the sphere of publicity. And it was associated with men. Men belonged to the public sphere. And men were associated with action, doing. Men were the doers. And the public sphere was also a place of possible dangers, of possible chaos. of possible errors. And it was thought at the time that only men, and especially educated men, could face the possible errors, the possible chaos, the possible dangers of this public sphere. So it was the sphere of society, it was the sphere of exchanges, it was the sphere of publicity, the sphere of possible chaos, possible dangers. And only men were associated with it. On the other hand, there was the private sphere, which was the sphere of home, the sphere of intimacy, the sphere of the inside, not the outside. And this private sphere was associated with women. And as opposed to chaos, dangers, errors, women were supposed to be perfect. They were supposed to be ideal spouses, perfect spouses. They should strive for perfection, and they represented harmony and peace. So you see why today, when there are discussions about gender roles, it's still very difficult for some people to get rid of these associations. They come from that period of time. Well, women at the time were not doers, they were not actors, they were rather spectators. And they especially had, I would say, a decorative function. They were supposed to be perfect. They were supposed to underline the strength, the power of their husband or father or brother. It doesn't mean that women were despised, not at all. They were praised, but they were praised for these qualities in particular. And of course, a woman who didn't want to conform to this model of the ideal woman was immediately criticized, mocked, considered to be an unnatural woman. We'll see this when we study the new women and how they had to fight to find a place in society. Well, we're going to focus on several texts which I included in your fascicule for weeks 1 and 2. Can you see anything? Yeah, it's coming? Yeah, good. Well, the first document is this one. It's a cartoon. And this one is obviously on the new visibility of the poor. And it's just an introduction because we'll spend several weeks on this. But it's a good introduction in the sense that it introduces a phenomenon of the time which was called slumming. Slumming meant going to the slums, to visit the slums. To visit the slums as if they were a kind of zoo where you went to discover a strange species of animals. But the species of animals in this particular case was, of course, the poor. So you see this place. How do you immediately associate this place with a destitute neighborhood? What makes you... Yeah.
The face of people who are poor is a little bit dirty.
Yes. So you have a first opposition between the way the people around here are drawn and the way the three people in the middle, in the center of the cartoon, are drawn. They seem to be quite, how can you...
Quite dressed up. Quite dressed up.
Yes, absolutely, dressed up. There are obviously upper middle class or aristocratic people. This one being a religious man, obviously, the way with a collar, etc. So they represent the few, the elite. There are only 3 of them, by the way. They represent the elite, they represent the few. They are well dressed. You see their features as well. They are less coarse than the features of these men, for instance. You see, completely different. You see how their faces seem to be very wide, whereas the faces of these men is, well, it seems to be dirty, or it seems to be, we don't know exactly, but it's coarser, obviously, than the other faces. So there is this first opposition. The opposition is also in terms of numbers. There are only 3 people representing the rich, whereas there is a multitude of people representing the poor. Well, this is characteristic, of course, of the proportion between rich and poor, especially as, obviously, the group of 3 people are visiting a poor neighborhood. If you look at the way they're dressed, it's exactly the same remark. They seem to be rags more than clothes, you see, and they are old clothes, obviously. But there's something else which is also an indication, if you look at the background especially, which is also an indication that this is obviously a poor neighborhood. Yes, Payam?
We can look at those 2 women that are looking at each other. The one in the left side, she represents a woman at home working, look at those all laundry around her head.
Yeah.
And the other woman is a little, open and walking in the, public.
Mm-hmm. So here, obviously, you have the workers, or people probably also working in the streets for most of them. This woman is probably doing her laundry. Yes, you're right here. You have the laundry in the background, which would have been impossible in a rich neighborhood, of course. This was typical of the streets, of the poor streets of the city. You also have the reference to alcohol, which doesn't mean that there was no alcohol in the wealthier parts, of course, but it was more hidden than this. And there was a multitude of pubs, gin houses, ale houses in the East End of London, for instance. So the background shows a very poor neighborhood. The people around, the crowd of people around represents the multitude of the poor, as opposed to the elite, represented by these 3 people. And obviously, who is visiting whom here?
The rich people visiting.
The rich people are visiting the poor. This was typical of slumming. Slumming meant that, well, generally it was on Sundays that you went slumming. It was a leisure activity for the rich.
Actually, there's an the boy and maybe the young boy or the girl, never mind. But the children on the right are doing the exact same thing that the lady on the left. Both are looking at the other side of the social.
Yeah, we'll underline this after, because this is the ironical twist in the cartoon, obviously. Yeah, so initially these 3 people came slumming. That is, they wanted to see the poor. They wanted, this was the new, it was a period where, when at the time, very few people had seen, very few aristocrats, etc., had seen poverty, in a way. So they thought it was a very thrilling, a very exciting activity for Sundays, generally. And you have accounts of people of the time who said that they put on a Macintosh, so had to be protected from the dirt of these people, and they went to the slums, exactly as they would go to the zoo. So they have just arrived in the slum. How would you describe their attitude to what they're discovering? Superior, obviously.
They don't dare to look at them.
Yeah, they don't dare to look at them directly in the eyes.
They look in front of them. Or
Well, this one, yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, the religious man, he represents religious, he represents, well, he seems to be looking straight ahead, not wanting to see what there is around. And the two women have a different attitude. Yes. One looks rather disgusted, afraid. The other one looks rather curious, absolutely. She would like to know more, obviously. So, you have this gaze, the gaze of the rich on the poor that are considered to be a kind of zoo, a kind of set of strange animals, as if they had never seen poor people before, as if they had never been, which was probably the case, as if they had never been to a destitute neighborhood before. So they are discovering a neighborhood of London which is probably next door. You know, the frontier between the East London and West London. When you are in Oxford Street, one part is in West London and the other end is almost East London. So it's really next door. But they are discovering this as if they were discovering the heart of Africa. But what is interesting, as you've said, what's your name? Yeah. Your name? Cedric. Yes, Cedric. As Cedric said, what is interesting is that the cartoonist, who was Georges du Maurier, probably heard about him, the cartoonist inverted the gaze. And it seems that the poor are also looking at the rich as if they were strange animals. They are here, they seem very surprised to see them, and they are looking at them, they are not afraid of looking at them, and they are looking at them directly in the eyes. And the comment, well, the legend is in Slumibus, and a small boy is saying, "Hello, here's a masher, look at his collar and that," as if he was surprised by the way they were dressed, by the way they looked, simply. And the social gap between the two. What is interesting in this cartoon is that first it shows the social gap between the poor and rich, the poor and the rich. The fact that they were almost as two different species, two different races, once again between quotes, because this was a word that they used at the time. To the rich, the poor were a race apart. But at the same time, it shows the beginning of mixing, the fact that in one public space, a poor public space here, there was a mixing between, well, men and women first. This was something quite new, even if here the two women were allowed to go in the public sphere because they were accompanied by a religious man, which made their, I would say, their walk through the East End respectable. But the mixing between genders, but also between social classes. It's not a full mixing, obviously, as the rich other the poor and the poor other the rich. Other, c'est-à-dire qu'ils mettent en avant les différences qui existent entre eux. So there is this notion of othering. The poor do not recognize themselves in the rich, and the rich do not recognize themselves in the poor. But at the same time, it's the beginning of mixing in a public space. So this is the first text I wanted to analyze with you. The first reactions to this new type of mixing here: class mixing, social mixing. Here you have something a little different but quite similar in a way. It's entitled Capital and Labour. Of course, capital representing those who rule society, bourgeois, the aristocrats, and labour representing the working class. And this text is an earlier text, 1843. And what is interesting here is that, as opposed to the first text, it shows a complete hermetic, you see, division between the poor here, and see how they're described, and the rich over there. The only presence of someone less rich and belonging to the working class. In the top pictures is the presence of this black man who is a servant, so who is more or less subjected to the will of the rich. So you see here in 1843 how the difference between poor and rich is or was represented. The poor seem to be living where?
Mine?
In a mine, yes, underground. They seem to be living underground, which represents the type of life that they had. You see, they seem to be reduced to what here? They cannot even stand. They are more or less crouching, crawling on the floor, as if they were animals, almost, you see?
Insects.
Yeah, insects, absolutely, like insects. You see, with all of them living in the same room, which was the conditions of living of the poor at the time. All of them living in the same room, in very destitute conditions, with people, with very small children, with people who seem to be ill, or who seem to be completely despaired. Look at this man also almost crouching, etc., etc. And look at this one, unable to stand because
yeah. There is also a rich presence in the poor sphere.
How?
There is this man sit on a gold bag.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And he has
This is written.
probably to give freedom
This
to
one.
poor.
Yeah. Who is it? This one.
Yes,
you're right.
It's. I see he has keys, so maybe he can give them their freedom, but he maybe he don't want. He wants to keep the money for him.
He's probably at the time there was what was called the sweating system. The sweating system, on utilise encore le terme quand on parle de l'esclavage moderne. Le sweating system, ça existe encore dans certains pays. C'est ce système où un homme, le sweater, donc ça lui c'est typiquement un sweater, donc il est plus riche que les autres. Il vient de la même classe que les autres, mais il a réussi à s'en sortir, donc c'est pour ça qu'il est assis sur de l'or. Et le sweater, ben, il faisait sweat les autres, ça faisait travailler les autres sans protection sociale, quasiment sans salaire à la fin du mois, etc. etc. Il les exploitait en fait. Et c'est ça, donc ça c'est the sweating system, which is represented here, with the sweater, the master sweater here, and all the people working for the sweater, including children. At the time, children started working by the age of 5 in the mines, because they were so small that they were very useful in the mines, and some of them were killed, of course, working in the mines. So the sweater is typical. So here's the link, you're right, with the world above. He's a kind of intermediary. He's someone from the working class initially, but someone from the working class who has accepted to exploit other workers and who has become rich thanks to this. And the others are all toiling for him.
And it also shows the comfort and everything that the rich people have is because of the poor people.
Absolutely. And it also shows that all the riches over there, all the comfort over there, is the product of the work of the poor. But here, even if you have the presence of this man here and the presence of this servant here, the dichotomy between the world of the poor and the world of the rich, which was the early Victorian period, is much more obvious than in the In Slumibus. In Slumibus, there is a mixing of the two. Of course, they reject one another, they don't understand one another, they other one another, but yet the mixing is already present.
It also shows that hook that is.
Yeah, the hook is
it
interesting.
shows that, you know, the upper classes or bourgeois classes try to adopt babies in that basket. So it's also, it could show you the mixing, as you said.
Yeah.
They adopt the babies to their, you know, classes.
Yeah, and especially the link between they are dependent on what happens here, obviously. Yes, very good. Well, now we'll turn to the way women started to, were seen initially, and how people reacted when they started to enter the public sphere. The first extract is an extract from a poem by Coventry Patmore, not a particularly famous poet, but the poem is famous because it gave rise to an expression which came to represent the Victorian woman, the ideal Victorian woman as she was described at the time. It is the expression, the angel in the house. The angel in the house is the title of this poem, and the Victorian woman was supposed to be an angel in the house. You see the notions of perfection, harmony, peace, etc. So look at the way a woman was supposed to behave according to Coventry Patmore. And by the way, he said he wrote the poem in praise of his own wife. Man must be pleased, ça commence bien, but him to please is woman's pleasure. Down the gulf of his condoled necessities, she casts her best, she flings herself. How often flings for naught, and yokes her heart to an icicle or whim, whose each impatient word provokes another, not from her, but him. While she, too gentle even to force his penitence by kindly replies, waits by, expecting his remorse, with pardon in her pitying eyes. And if he once, by shame oppressed, a comfortable word confers, she leans and weeps against his breast, and seems to think the sin was hers. And while his love has any life, or any eye to see her charms, at any time she's still his wife, dearly devoted to his arms. She loves with love that cannot tire, and when, woe, she loves alone, though through passionate duty love springs higher, as grass grows taller round a stone. Alors la syntaxe n'est pas particulièrement facile, mais, well, how was the woman supposed to be, according to Coventry Patmore? This is a poem dating back to the mid-Victorian period, yes, 1858. What are the main points in this poem to define woman?
The adjective that I use for the woman is
Yes.
very, like what we say.
So what kind of adjectives?
Like she has to lean, she has to weep, she has to pardon, she
Yeah.
has to be patient, she has
So
to be
patience, yeah. Able to pardon everything, even when the husband behaves in the wrong way. Her replies are always kind, even if he speaks very harshly to her, she should reply kindly, pardon, pitying, shame. No, shame it's for the man here, sorry. And she weeps against his breast. That is, obviously, the man is seen as the comforter. The woman is seen as the comforter in a way, but she is seen as inferior to the man, obviously. There's one word that he uses for the husband, and it's an interesting one. It's the word icicle. What does it imply? A man should have, et on retrouve ça encore aujourd'hui, hein?
That love is a woman thing. It
Yeah.
doesn't have a man involved.
Or emotions at least, yes, emotions including love. Yeah, it's a woman's thing.
To be focused, focused on war, on battles.
Absolutely.
And women are the emotions.
Absolutely. It's this idea that women are emotional, not men. So you see how long it has been and still is to get rid of this, that emotions is the realm of women only. And it's almost as if it was imposed, you see, on women. They should be emotional. They should be patient. They should be angels in the house. That is, they should wait for the man to come back home. And once he's home, even if he's impatient, even if he's even harsh with her, then she should be patient and wait until he accepts to be kinder. This is exactly the idea here.
And the idea of crying, again, is for women,
Crying,
not for men.
absolutely. This is not something for men to do, but this is something for women to do, they thought at the time. She weeps against his breast and seems to think the sin was hers. That is, she should also feel the guilt. Guilt is not a feeling for men. Guilt is a feeling for women, they thought at the time. So the man was the doer, the man was the one who went outside to work, to earn money. He was the one who fought in battles. He was the one who should remain strong as a rock, as an icicle. And the word icicle, of course, the image of the icicle is even maybe stronger than the rock.
That's what I was
Yeah.
going to say. The last line is just perfect, give a perfect idea of what it means. That the man is a rock, something you can count on.
Yeah, rely on.
And the women to be, on his thinking, respectable, has to grow around the rock, around
Yes.
the man. But he also said that he compares women to grass, which is life.
Yeah.
And rock, which is something still. So in a way,
Eternal, but still.
yeah.
You're right. Yeah, but in all these descriptions, as you'll see, there is a real expression of love for women, but in a certain role. So it's not despising for women, and we'll see a text by John Ruskin, which goes even further than this. It's a praise of women, but women in a certain typical role.
Can we say this one, it also has the notion of religion in it? It also,
Oh yes, of course,
it
yes.
refers back to the original sin. Who committed that sin was
Eve.
Eve,
Yeah,
woman.
of course,
And now
of course.
we have, and seem to think the sin.
Yeah, the
was
sin
her.
was hers, like Eve, absolutely, yes. It has biblical overtones, obviously. Very good. So now it's a pamphlet written in the 19th century. I don't know exactly when, I would say mid-19th century, on women's rights. So you'll see what women's rights are. The right to be a comforter when other comforts fail. The right to cheer the drooping heart when troubles most assail. The right to train the infant mind to think of heaven and God. The right to guide the tiny feet, the path our Saviour trod. The right to solace the distress, to wipe the mourner's tear. The right to shelter the oppressed and gently chide each fear. The right to be a bright sunbeam in high or lowly home. The right to smile with loving gleam and point to joys to come. The right to fan the fevered brow, to ease the troubled mind, and gently tell in accents low, all those who seek shall find. Such as the noblest woman's rights, the rights which God hath given, the right to comfort man on earth and smooth his path to heaven. So you have exactly the same idea here. That is, what is the role of the woman?
To bring solace to men.
To bring solace to man. Yes, to bring solace to man. Woman was supposed not to be aware of the problems of the world, of the larger world outside. So she was supposed to be always thinking that everything would be fine if she could just comfort children and men, that is, all those she was supposed to take care of. So woman was a comforter.
It looked like she was
Sorte
an
de doudou,
object.
quoi. Yeah.
It would look like she's the object here, like
Yeah,
a robot.
of course. She's more or less objectified. She's like, a tiny kind of teddy bear that would comfort you when you're in need of comfort or solace. So it's exactly the same idea, and it was a widespread idea at the time. But maybe this is even more developed in a text by John Ruskin in the mid 19th century. I want to show the situation before the periods that we're going to analyze. And where he speaks of the guiding function of woman, it's, in the pamphlet we've just read, this notion of woman as a guide was already present. So the guiding function, and Ruskin, who was a philosopher, asked himself the question, how is it pertinent to say that a woman has a guiding function which means that she's doing an action in a way, and to say that she should be subjected to her husband. So he wants to show how it is not contradictory to say that a wife should be subjected to her husband or her father before she's married, and to say at the same time that she has a guiding function. And this is the point of his essay. He's trying to develop this. We are foolish. Alors ça commence plutôt bien. We are foolish, and without excuse foolish, in speaking of the superiority of one sex to the other, as if they could be compared. Ça continue moins bien. Ah, donc il part sur l'idée que on ne devrait pas dire que l'homme est supérieur à la femme, mais on ne devrait pas dire que l'homme est supérieur à la femme, non pas parce qu'il n'est pas supérieur à la femme, il est égal, mais parce que ce n'est pas la même chose, tout simplement. Hein, c'est comme si c'était deux races différentes, là encore. Hein. Donc c'est cette idée dès le départ. Donc c'est ça son idée, c'est qu'en fait on ne peut pas parler de supériorité parce que ce n'est pas la même chose, un homme et une femme. Each has what the other has not. Each completes the other, and is completed by the other. They are in nothing alike, and the happiness and perfection of both depends on each asking and receiving from the other what the other only can give. So it's the, of course, at a time of gender studies and discussions on the definition of gender, this seems quite shocking. The idea that a man is, in a way, the opposite of a woman, that they have nothing in common, that one completes one another, and that it is almost unthinkable to imagine that a woman should have male features, characteristics, or that a man should have female features, characteristics. You understand why any type of difference was completely rejected at the time. Now their separate characters are briefly these. The man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, the creator, the discoverer, the defender. His intellect is for speculation and invention. His energy for adventure, for war, and for conquest, wherever war is just, bien sûr, wherever conquest necessary. But the woman's power is for rule, not for battle. And her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement, decision. She sees the qualities of things, their claims, their places. Her great function is praise. She enters into no contest, but infallibly adjudges the crown of contest. By her office and place, she is protected from all danger and temptation. The man, in his rough work in the open world, must encounter all peril and trial. To him, therefore, must be the failure, the offence, the inevitable error. Often he must be wounded, subdued, often misled, and always hardened. But he guards her woman from all this, the woman from all this. Within his house, as ruled by her, unless she herself has sought it, need enter no danger, no temptation, no cause of error or offence. And you see here, within his house, as ruled by her, unless she herself has sought it, need enter no danger, no temptation, no cause of error, of offense. As if something happened to a woman within the home, it would be her own fault. It would be her own fault. It would be because she had exposed herself to this danger. This is the true nature of home. It is the place of peace, the shelter not only from all injury, but from all terror, doubt, division. Insofar as it is not this, it is not home. So far as the anxieties of the outer life penetrate into it, and the inconsistently minded, unknown, unloved, or hostile society of the outer world is allowed by either husband or wife to cross the threshold, it ceases to be home. It is then only a part of that outer world which you have roofed over and lighted fire in. But so far as it is a sacred place, a vestal temple, a temple of the hearth watched over by household gods, before whose faces none may come but those whom they can receive with love, so far as it is this, and roof and fire are types only of a nobler shade and light, shade as of the rock in a weary land, and light as of the pharos in the stormy sea, so far it vindicates the name and fulfills the praise of home. And wherever a true wife comes, this home is always round her. The stars only may be over her head, the glowworm in the night-cold grass may be the only fire at her foot, but home is yet wherever she is, and for a noble woman it stretches far around her, better than sealed with cedar or painted with vermilion, shedding its quiet light far for those who else were homeless. This is the woman's true place and power. But do you not see that to fulfill this, she must, as far as one can use such terms of a human creature, be incapable of error. So far as she rules, all must be right, or nothing is. She must be enduringly, incorruptibly good, instinctively, infallibly wise. Wise not for self-development, but for self-renunciation. Wise not that she may set herself above her husband, but that she may never fail from his side. Wise not with the narrowness of insolent and loveless pride, but with the passionate gentleness of an infinitely variable, because infinitely applicable modesty of service, the true changefulness of woman. In that great sense, la donna è mobile, not qual pium al vento, no, nor yet variable as the shades by the light quivering aspen made, but variable as the light, manifold in fair and serene division, that it may take the colour of all that it falls upon and exalt it. So, what are the main ideas in this description of what an ideal woman should be? Yeah? Oh, well, first you and then you. Yeah.
She should make no mistake.
Your first name is? Pauline. That she should make no mistake, yes. So you see, a man can make mistakes. A woman should not. A woman should not. Which explains a lot of things on the way women were treated at the time. Which explains, in particular, not only, but in particular, the fact that when, for instance, when there were, for instance, laws against prostitution, the only victims of these laws were women. The men were never arrested for using the services of prostitutes. Only the prostitutes were arrested for this. Or when, for instance, there was the Contagious Act disease that was passed, which aimed at checking that prostitutes did not have venereal diseases. They checked the prostitutes, but never the clients. Whereas, obviously, the disease was carried by the clients as well. But a woman should make no error. So, a man necessarily made errors. It was even part of his identity, in a way. A woman should make no error. There's also the association, yes?
I want to say this man, this author, was very smart man, because at first he started with praising
Of course.
women and saying, we are equal, there's no problem, but the place of women is at home.
Yeah.
He's very focusing on home. It
Of course.
says there's no place for you in a public sphere. You have to be at home, and this is your place. The woman has to be at home, but men are for battle, everything. And the action for men, the passive forms is just
Passivity for women, yes, absolutely. And she's compared with nature. Especially, you remember the image of the grass. Here you find these images of nature as well. Why is woman associated with nature?
Because she's the one coming to birth.
Yeah, absolutely, because she
she's
gives
emotional.
birth. Yeah, and because,
She is emotional.
and also the notion of emotionality. There's a sentence by Baudelaire which I like quoting, even if it's quite shocking in itself. It's when he wrote an essay on the dandy, and yet his poems are beautiful, but he wrote an essay on the dandy. Vous savez ce que c'est un dandy? Un dandy, c'est un homme, en général, c'est jamais une femme, c'est un homme qui, en général, cultive sa vie comme s'il était lui-même une œuvre d'art. Hein? Donc, le dandy du 19e siècle ou du 18e siècle, c'était un homme qui passait son temps à trouver la couleur qu'il fallait absolument pour sa cravate par rapport à sa chemise. Enfin bref, il ne faisait rien de la journée, à part Mais c'était une philosophie de vie aussi, le dandisme, c'est-à-dire se considérer comme sa propre œuvre d'art. Hein, dandisme. Et Baudelaire, je le cite en français puisqu'il l'a écrit en français, Baudelaire a écrit un essai sur le dandisme, lui-même était un dandy, et Baudelaire a écrit un essai sur le dandisme où il écrit, alors je ne sais pas si c'est les mots exacts, mais c'est à peu près ça, la femme est naturelle, il dit qu'une femme ne peut pas être dandy, il dit, la femme est naturelle, donc elle doit faire horreur, hein, elle a soif et elle veut boire, elle a faim, elle veut manger, elle est en rut, elle veut, alors je sais pas, il dit pas elle veut baiser, mais enfin c'est l'équivalent, elle est en rut, elle veut se faire, je sais plus quoi. Voilà, donc ça c'est la définition de la femme par Baudelaire. Et la femme par Baudelaire, c'est ça, c'est la femme qui répond à ses instincts primitifs, d'une certaine manière, alors que l'homme n'est pas censé, selon lui, répondre à ses instincts primitifs. Ah, donc c'est la vision de la femme telle qu'elle était au XIXe siècle. Well, now we'll read extracts from texts written at the end of the 19th century, this time 1819, etc., when women started to enter the public sphere. And when more and more women could be seen, not only in the poor neighborhoods, but also in the bourgeois public sphere. And these are reactions to the presence of women in the public sphere. We'll study in detail, of course, the way women entered the public sphere, but I just wanted to show you a few reactions. The first one is on the presence by George Augustus Sala, 5 p.m., a corner of the world, Westminster. So it's a description of Westminster, and especially a description of omnibuses in Westminster. The omnibuses and road cars seem to me to be about 3 times bigger than they were a generation since, and they are always crowded inside and out. The ladies riding on those garden seats, which have replaced the old knife boards, look as though they were altogether to the manner born and had not the slightest idea that 25 years ago no member of the fair sex above the rank of a servant girl would have condescended to travel outside an omnibus. So this is the first remark that you can very often see in texts of the time, showing that the situation of women had changed. What is he stressing here is that 25 years before, what you can see in the omnibus, that is the presence of ladies, ladies from all social classes, not only the servant girl going to work, could be seen now on the omnibuses. And you see that the name of the seats has changed now that they are for women. It's very interesting to see this. Look at how the seats were called before. The knife boards, something quite violent, manly, in the terms of the time. And now they are called the garden seats. Yes, the garden seats. Much closer to nature, you see, much more harmonious, peaceful, etc. So even the vocabulary seems to have changed for these seats that are now partly occupied by ladies, the fair sex, as he calls them. Then he's going to describe in another text, well, it's still the same book, but it's another text, is going to describe the company of women in buses. And look at the last paragraph. This eventually led to the adoption of what is known as the garden seat system. And to me, it is positively delightful to watch, looking out of the window, the transformation of the formerly barren or at the most menfolk-frequented roofs of the buses into so many brilliant parterres of tastefully dressed ladies who gaily ascend the staircases and seat themselves on the commodious benches at right angles with the longitudinal sides of the bus. I've fallen hopelessly in love with hundreds of brilliant bonnets and handsome hats, to say nothing of skirts and sunshades of every colour of the rainbow, and I only regret that the attitude of my apartments precluded me from scanning the countenances of the doubtless lovely occupants of the garden seats. Perhaps, for the sake of domestic peace and quiet, it is better that I should have admired the costumes and not become acquainted with the fascinating lineaments of the wearers thereof. What do you think of these remarks? How are these women, if the public sphere seen by the author here?
As flowers?
Yeah, as flowers, as decoration. As decoration, once again, as decorative elements, obviously. He insists on the colors, the multitude of colors, the brightness of them all.
And then he said that he prefers to see them than to speak to them.
I'm not sure this is what he means here. How do you understand the last sentence? He says for domestic peace and quiet, it's better that I should have admired the costumes rather than the lineaments of their wearers. How do you understand this? Yeah, he means that he means that he's attracted to them. He admits that he's attracted to them, but probably it's better not to speak to them, because otherwise maybe his wife would be jealous or something like that. See, so women here are seen obviously in decorative terms. They are decorative. It's nicer to see, and it's still the same type of adjectives that were used before about women. That is, they have a decorative function. They are more pleasant to look at than an omnibus full of men. This is what he mostly says. So there is this decorative function, and there is also, he describes them as what, especially in the last sentence,
The tame one, the one that they are domestic.
The tamed one?
Tamed one, like
No.
when the animal is wild, you would
Ah, yeah. I'm not sure here.
Like,
No,
this
I
is
wouldn't
the
say here.
domestic piece.
I know, but domestic peace, he means that he
I
doesn't
know
want
what
to
it
know
means,
them
but
more.
it doesn't show that notion.
I'm not sure. No, because he speaks of himself here, domestic peace. Well, they are objects of desire, obviously. That is, once they have entered the public sphere, they become objects of desire. And he expresses this desire himself. And this will be the link with the next texts. The next text is a series of, well, they date back to before, but it was the beginning, 1860s, 70s, it was the beginning of women entering the public sphere. And it is a series of letters to the editor of the Times on what we would call today street harassment. That is, when women, respectable women, between quotes, started entering the public sphere, the notion of street harassment started. That is, they became objects of desire. And they had to go through certain situations, certain unpleasant situations. Well, we won't have time to study this today because, yeah, we're going to stop now if you have another class. But last time we'll try to have a look at them and to have a look at the last text before starting studying the new visibility of foreigners in London. But read them before and you'll see that it's very interesting to see the way people reacted to women in the streets when they appeared for the first time in the streets.
Si t'as changé de cours en version, on va dans What the fuck?